Section 5.3, Testing Data Persistence with Spring and Testcontainers. In the previous sections, we added data persistence functionality to an application by developing against a PostgreSQL database in a container, which is the same technology used in production. That was a good step toward the environment parity recommended by the 15-factor methodology. Keeping all environments as similar as possible improves the quality of the project. Data sources are one of the primary causes of differences across environments. It's common practice to use an in-memory database while developing locally, something like H2 or HSQL. But that affects the predictability and robustness of your applications. Even if all relational databases speak the SQL language and Spring Data JDBC provides generic abstractions, each vendor has its own dialect and unique features that make it essential to use the same database in production that you use in development and testing. Otherwise, you may not catch errors that might happen only in production. What about testing, you might ask? That is an excellent question. Another reason for using in-memory databases is to make integration tests more accessible. However, integration tests are also supposed to test the integration with your application's external services. Using something like H2 makes those tests less reliable. Each commit should be a candidate for release when adopting a continuous delivery approach. Suppose the auto tests run by the deployment pipeline are not using the same backing services used in production. In that case, you'll need to do extra manual testing before deploying the application safely in production because you can't be sure it will work correctly. Therefore, it's essential to reduce the gap between environments. Docker makes it easier to set up and develop applications with an actual database locally, as you experienced with PostgreSQL. In a similar way, Testcontainers, a Java library for testing, makes it easy to use backing services as containers in the context of integration tests. This section will show you how to write slice tests for the data persistence layer using the data JDBC test annotation and include a database in integration tests using the Spring Boot test annotation. In both cases, you'll rely on Testcontainers to run the auto tests against an actual PostgreSQL database. Section 5.3.1, Configuring Testcontainers for PostgreSQL. Testcontainers, testcontainers.org, is a Java library for testing. It supports Junit and provides lightweight throwaway containers such as databases, message brokers, and web servers. It's perfect for implementing integration tests with the actual backing services used in production. The result is more reliable and stable tests, which lead to higher quality applications and favor continuous delivery practices. You can configure a lightweight PostgreSQL container with Testcontainers and use it in your auto tests involving a data persistence layer. Let's see how it works. First, you need to add a dependency on the Testcontainers module for PostgreSQL in the build.gradle file of your catalog service project. Remember to refresh or re-import the Gradle dependencies after the new addition.
Listing 5.16, Adding dependency on Testcontainers in catalog service.
When running tests, we want the application to use a PostgreSQL instance provided by Testcontainers rather than the one we configured earlier via the spring.datasource.url property. We can overwrite that value in a new application integration.yml file created under src/test/resources. Any property defined in this file will take precedence over the main one when the integration profile is enabled. In this case, we'll overwrite the value for spring.datasource.url following a format defined by Testcontainers. Create a new application integration.yml file in src/test/resources and add the following configuration.
Listing 5.17, Using a PostgreSQL data source provided by Testcontainers.
That's all we need to configure Testcontainers. When the integration profile is enabled, Spring Boot will use the PostgreSQL container instantiated by Testcontainers. We're now ready to write auto tests to verify the data persistence layer. Section 5.3.2, Testing Data Persistence with Data JDBC Test and Testcontainers. As you might recall from Chapter 3, Spring Boot allows you to run integration tests by loading only the Spring components used by a specific application slice tests. In Catalog Service, we created tests for the MVC and the JSON slices. Now I'll show you how to write tests for the data slice. Create a book repository JDBC tests class and mark it with the data JDBC test annotation. That will trigger Spring Boot to include all Spring Data JDBC entities and repositories in the application context. It will also auto-configure JDBC aggregate template, a lower-level object we can use to set up the context for each test case instead of using the repository, the object under testing.
Listing 5.18. Integration tests for the data JDBC slice.
The data JDBC test annotation encapsulates handy features. For example, it makes each test method run in a transaction and rolls it back at its end, keeping the database clean. After running the test method in listing 5.18, the database will not contain the book created in FindBook by ISBN when existing, because the transaction is rolled back at the end of the method's execution. Let's verify that the test containers configuration works. First, make sure the Docker engine is running in your local environment. Then open a terminal window, navigate to the root folder of your catalog service project, and run the following command to ensure the tests are successful. Under the hood, test containers will create a PostgreSQL container before the test's execution and remove it at the end.
See this code?
In the code repository accompanying the book, you can find more examples of unit and integration tests for the catalog service project. The following section will cover how to run full integration tests with test containers. Section 5.3.3, Integration Tests with Spring Boot Test and Test Containers. In the Catalog Service application, we already have a Catalog Service Application Tests class annotated with Spring Boot Test and containing full integration tests. The test containers configuration we defined earlier applies to all auto tests for which the integration profile is enabled, so we need to add the profile configuration to the Catalog Service Application Tests class.
Listing 5.19. Enabling integration profile for the integration tests.
Open a terminal window, navigate to the root folder of your catalog service project, and run the following command to ensure the tests are successful. Under the hood, test containers will create a PostgreSQL container before the test's execution and remove it at the end.
See this code?
Good job! You have added data persistence to a Spring Boot application and written tests while ensuring environment parity. Let's move on and complete this chapter by discussing how to manage schemas and data in production.